Okay, welcome everybody. Right, I'm going to be totally open with you guys. It's my third year at Nordic APIs, okay? I write for the blog, and I feel that getting out there and presenting is a good way of getting my face out from behind the words that I write. You may disagree and may think that my face should stay behind the blog, but anyway, I have to be honest, I'm not a natural presenter. I get flustered. I don't like to not sound like myself. I found that this other voice is coming out from me that isn't me. And I flap my arms a lot like some sort of demented bird, trying to get all these words out. So this year, do it differently. So my guide to prepping like a pro, be yourself. I think that's working so far. I sound like myself. Relax. Key point. I got to Stockholm early. Had a great weekend. Lots of food. Went to museums. Had a great time. Read the awesome speaker's guide cover to cover to make sure I knew exactly what I was doing. Very important laptop check. Got here in the break. Made sure my laptop was working. And finally got drunk with a keynote speaker last night. So I've shared my preparation tips. What are you guys thinking? I'm thinking this is going all right. I sound like myself. Yeah, that's great. But some people might be thinking, what an idiot. Going out drinking before the event? How unprofessional. Others might think, you've just confessed that you're a rubbish speaker, so this is going to be a really boring 20 minutes. You're supposed to be talking about APIs. This is Nordic APIs event. Why are you carrying on about all this stuff about nerves and what have you? Which keynote speaker actually got drunk? If I started again, perhaps I shouldn't be so open. First off, get straight to the point. Stop blabbering about nerves. Tailored my language. Had some drinks rather than got drunk. Protected the privacy of others. Kept the fact I'd been out with a keynote speaker for drinks last night to myself. All of this has a point, and the point is, like me, our APIs shouldn't be too open. Open APIs are ideal, right? They're a goal and a sort of a conceptual means of delivering APIs, and typically they're characterized on being publicly available, so on the internet, open across the internet for anybody to connect to. Very few barriers to entry. And what I mean by that is either zero or a simple enrollment model so that you can either use them without registering or register for a simple API key or whatever with a permissive terms of use. And by permissive terms of use, I mean so that a developer can actually just click through the terms and conditions when they register without really looking at them. And they're based on open standards, because open standards, right, are a good thing. You know, there's tooling out there to support open standards. They're usually a useful thing for developers to have at their fingertips. But rarely is it thus. So, APIs can carry this open label, but there's only one open factor, that they're publicly available on the internet. The enrollment model can be a barrier to entry, either through complexity, so a guy working on his own wants to consume an API, but it's a very hard process to do so, or the terms of use for a developer or the developer's organization are far too restrictive, either from the perspective of how the API is available or the legal framework that sits behind it. So there's no way they can use that API given what the provider puts on the developer as a consumer. Also, the standards, whilst being called open, might be built by a relatively closed group. That might be by design, or it might just be because that's the way it is. And they're often backed by regulation. So APIs that are backed by regulation naturally have a very limited framework in which they can be used. So this whole open label isn't always the case. And my example is open banking, right? Open banking takes its open bit directly from open APIs. It's big news, right? You see tons of blog posts in the financial services industry, lots and lots of coverage of it, how great it is, blah 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 blah, right? And people like PricewaterhouseCoopers forecast a 7.2 billion market by 2022. But how open is open banking? So right now, open banking is largely driven in Europe by PSD2. Payment Services Directive 2 is a European regulation that's basically there as a means to open up the banking market. It doesn't mandate that banks provide APIs, but that's kind of the way it's going. Does it encourage openness is the question. Well, it's open to some, okay? And what I mean by that is it introduces new third parties into the banking industry, or the financial services industry more accurately. So these are collectively known as third-party providers. And those third-party providers fall into one of two camps. Account information service provider, and what they can do is, with customer consent, go and get information from a customer's account and use it in some means to benefit the customer. The classic example is account aggregation. If a customer wants to know how much they can spend on dog food or whatever across all their accounts in a given month, if an account aggregator can go and collect all that data up and serve it to them in one place, that's the sort of the classic example. But there's other examples, like a customer may want to prove accurately their income and outgoings in order to apply for a mortgage, and companies like Zopa in the UK are accessing open banking APIs in order to provide that service to customers. So there's this account aggregation, account access role that PSD2 introduces. The other one is payment initiation services provider. So a customer can make a payment directly from their account to another third party, and a payment initiation services provider, a PISP, can do that on their behalf. So PSD2 is creating these roles, and it's always on behalf of the customer. It's never something they can do in isolation. They have to have the consent of the customer in order to carry out these API calls. But these parties, they're financially regulated entities. So PSD2 is what's called a maximum harmonization framework. So in each country in the EU that's implementing APIs under the auspices of PSD2, they all do it slightly differently, and it's the local financial authority, like the FCA in the UK, that says that these guys are allowed into the PSD2 market, that you can be an account information services provider or a payment information services provider, or you can be both of these things, and you have to be on their register in order to play. The key point is the customer can't play on their own. You have to use one of these third parties in order to access APIs that are delivered by banks under the auspices of PSD2. The only way that you can play on your own is if the bank provides a separate role that's non-PSD2 focused, or if they provide separate APIs just for customers. So the key point here is just this: it's open, but open a very little bit rather than open hugely. So at the time right now. That's all kind of hypothetical, but the UK and the evolution of the standards in the UK and what's happening with the delivery of open banking standards there gives us some neat examples of how this openness is manifested. So disclosure, I work on open banking standards in the UK at the moment as an architect, and I've worked at HSBC on the same project. So I'm not representing any of these people today. Just want to get that out there before I say any of this. So the UK example, we're talking about open banking. Open Banking Limited is actually a private company that was formed purely to deliver open banking standards. So again, this open label is somewhat misused. It's a private company with, a board and all the rest of the stuff that goes with a private company. It was created on the orders of the CMA, which is the Competition and Market Authority, which, following a report back in 2015, I think, 2016, decided that the UK banking market needs to be opened up. It would be good to get in there before PSD2 became an enforceable regulation. I'm pretty sure it was before Brexit, so then they actually cared. So the CMA ordered the creation of Open Banking Limited, that this separate entity was created in order to drive the development of standards. But the standards are actually largely delivered by the 9 largest banks. So the CMA's order said, hey, you 9 largest banks in the UK, our market's not open enough. We need open banking standards. So you guys that are the incumbents, go and deliver these standards, right? Why in their wisdom they did that, I don't know. But that's what the CMA order equates to. So again, this open label, when a lot of the work that goes into creating the standards is orchestrated by a small subset of companies, admittedly with a very large market share, there's the possibility that the open label isn't quite right. And the UK market, because it's got a nod to PSD2, is for AISPs and PISPs only, right? So those 2 roles that PSD2 brought into existence, those guys are what these standards are for. So anecdotally, when I was at HSBC, we were there developing the standards and actually implementing the APIs as they're being developed. And the amount of emails we used to get from people in the market saying, oh, you're doing an open banking thing. Great. How can I get an API key? How can I develop my own application? It's like, actually, you need to wait for the TPPs to come along and give that service to you. We can't work directly with consumers. So again, this open label is kind of a bit of a misnomer for what are essentially standards that are supposed to be open in nature. But it's not all bad. The open bits of the UK standard, everything's publicly available. So despite the fact it's a private company and the involvement of the 9 largest banks, you can go on their developer's zone, access all the standards, access how they're built. So all that information is there and available for you to understand why the standards are the way they are and know how they're going to evolve. At version 3, they delivered a PSD2 compatible framework that could be taken anywhere. So in Europe, there's competing standards like UK Open Banking, like the Berlin Group, for attempting to harmonise what the APIs that are delivered across Europe look like. And at version 3, UK Open Banking produced standards that could be taken anywhere to any market, inside Europe or out. They're also built on a bunch of open and open-ish standards. So we use JSON API for request response, making sure that everything's wrapped in this payload, which describes data, metadata, and links in the same way with every request response. So there's familiarity, tooling, and all that good stuff that can be leveraged in order for it be easier for consumers to implement the client. It leveraged the ISO 222 data model. So ISO 222, if you don't know that, is financial standards for different subject areas like accounts or payments or whatever. And there's a data model that sits under it. A lot of people that work with ISO don't like the actual construct of the messages, but the data model that sits underneath that is quite rich. And what we did with the standards was built everything on top of a flattened model so that when you say account type or account subtype, you mean the ISO version, which everybody understands. When you say the scheme is account number sort code in the UK. Everybody understands that. So we're leveraging standards that are open and easily referenceable. Use OpenID Connect, specifically hybrid flow for authentication, authorization, and so on, because it's an open standard. There's the tooling there. It's the implementation of it in the server-side technology. So something that can be leveraged really easily by the community. And also, Open Banking worked with the OpenID Foundation to cultivate the financial API grade or FAPI standards. So FAPI is a working group that's part of the OpenID Foundation that's specifically looking to come up with standards around authentication, authorization for financial APIs. And that means both like the traditional authorization code type flows, where users are redirected in order to authenticate and authorize access to their account, and also newer flows around app-to-app type scenarios. So, in essence, we've got this kind of, yes, it's a private company. Yes, there's the 9 largest banks in the background who are potentially not the most open, but there's also all this great stuff happening, which is leveraging open standards and making sure that where we leverage open standards, we also contribute to them by virtue of promoting and cultivating FAPI. And we should also remember that open banking is a journey, right? So go on LinkedIn, read some blogs. There's a Slack thing about open banking with a lot of people slating what it's doing and how it's being implemented in the UK. But it's a journey. What's happening with PSD2 is one stop on the way, right? And the market's going to evolve because we're going to get over this hump where all the banks across Europe are struggling. They're not struggling, but everyone's working hard to implement their APIs. And suddenly we're going to go from a place where API coverage is sporadic to everybody has APIs. And then once everybody's done that hard bit, how does the market evolve next? What does regulation say next? So the market's going to evolve, and there'll be more stops rather than the just now of PSD2, where the market will become more open. Obviously in a financially regulated kind of way, but nonetheless, it's going to deliver more. So, to conclude, open APIs, they're kind of a concept and a goal, but how open they should be is dependent on 2 things. Your industry, the amount of regulation, who should be allowed to play, your audience, what are they demanding? Every provider should deliver APIs based on that context. And nobody got drunk last night, as that would be highly unprofessional. Okay. Thank you. It's time to eat. After Q&A.
Thank you.